After oil prices skyrocketed to more than $100 a barrel, meaning gas prices could spike next.
Oil prices are soaring this morning, continuing a sharp climb that began after the U.S. and Israel launched major strikes on Iran last week.
Unfortunately, those average pump prices are going to head up to around $3.40 a gallon, and that's if things go well. But as you mentioned in the open, if we don't see the Strait of Hormuz opening to commercial traffic, I'm afraid we're only at the beginning of the price increases, and they'll go much higher.
Mark Carney just made a decision that could fundamentally reshape North American energy markets. The pricing model that once gave American refineries access to Canadian crude at massive discounts has effectively ended, and the timing could not be worse for the United States. Because while Canadian oil once sold for a fraction of global prices due to lack of export alternatives, Mark Carney now controls routes to Asia, Europe, and markets willing to pay top dollar. The leverage has shifted, and Washington is discovering what happens when your neighbor stops needing you as desperately as you need them. Canada spent years building infrastructure that made a global pivot possible. The expansion of the Trans Mountain pipeline dramatically increased the country's capacity to move oil from Alberta toward the Pacific coast, nearly triple through that corridor. A major pipeline connecting Alberta's oil sands to Canada's Pacific coast now transports about 890,000 barrels of crude oil each day toward shipping terminals where tankers can head west across the Pacific Ocean toward Asian markets. Within a single year, non-American exports of Canadian crude increased by approximately 289% as new buyers across Asia began testing shipments from the newly expanded route. China alone purchased around 100 million barrels of Canadian oil during an 11-month period as tankers began appearing more frequently at Pacific terminals. That number is staggering. 18 months ago, many analysts argued Canada had little choice but to sell its energy almost entirely to the United States because no alternative export infrastructure existed, and that assumption no longer holds true. Years of investment created new routes that allow Canadian resources to reach global markets, and those routes now provide leverage during one of the most significant energy disruptions in recent memory. The journey from Canada's Pacific coast to Asia takes roughly 10 days, which is about half the time required for Middle Eastern cargo traveling the traditional route when the Strait of Hormuz remains open. In the current situation with the Middle East in chaos, the route cannot operate reliably at all, leaving many countries suddenly aware that one of the few stable suppliers sits thousands of miles away in North America. Canada also controls enormous energy reserves that give the country a powerful position during any global supply shock. Canadian oil reserves total approximately 163 billion barrels of proven crude, placing the country fourth in the world, behind only Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. Production levels approach 6 million barrels per day when counting conventional oil, along with output from Alberta's massive oil sands operations. These numbers mean Canada can supply a large portion of international demand without relying on vulnerable shipping lanes that cross conflict zones. Few nations can claim such a combination of resources and infrastructure at a moment when global supply lines feel increasingly fragile, and demand is exploding. India stands near the top of the list of countries desperately seeking new suppliers. The nation imports roughly 90% of its oil and previously relied heavily on shipments passing through the Strait of Hormuz. With fewer than 10 days of emergency reserves available in storage, India faces urgent pressure to secure new suppliers capable of delivering crude quickly. During recent diplomatic conversations, an Indian official reportedly told Canadian representatives that India would purchase whatever Canada is offering, which reflects the intensity of the current shortage. A country with 1.4 billion people cannot allow its energy supply to collapse, and the sudden loss of Middle Eastern shipments forces decision makers in New Delhi to pursue any reliable alternative. Japan faces similar exposure because the island nation imports nearly all of its energy resources and must rely on maritime routes to keep refineries operating. South Korea has already established a foothold in Canadian energy markets through long-term LNG purchases. And that arrangement now appears remarkably strategic as gas shipments from the Gulf face uncertainty. European countries also watch the situation closely because many governments spent years reducing dependence on Russian gas and now worry that Middle Eastern supply routes could become unreliable as well. Canada possesses something extremely valuable in this environment because the country produces oil, natural gas, liquefied natural gas, and uranium while exporting those resources through routes that avoid the world's most dangerous choke points. Natural gas exports add another layer to Canada's energy influence. A major liquefied natural gas terminal on the coast of British Columbia now sends LNG cargo toward Asia and operates at a capacity capable of supporting roughly 170 tanker shipments each year when running at full output. South Korea already purchases Canadian LNG from that facility, creating a direct energy link that bypasses the geopolitical tension surrounding Middle Eastern gas supplies. The construction of LNG Canada in northern British Columbia marked another massive step forward because the $40 billion facility represents the largest private investment ever made in Canadian history. With its first cargo already shipped and operations underway, the terminal provides a direct gateway for natural gas exports across the Pacific. These resources have transformed Canada from a regional supplier into a country capable of filling gaps in global markets whenever disruptions occur elsewhere. When benchmark oil prices climb toward $100 per barrel because shipments from the Gulf cannot move, Canadian crude suddenly carries far more value than it did under the old system. Buyers across Asia and Europe recognize that Canadian oil travels through secure routes and therefore represents a dependable alternative. While the Middle East remains unstable, demand has already begun appearing from countries that rarely purchased Canadian energy before. Here is what that means for the United States. American refineries built their operations assuming Canadian crude would always be available at massive discounts. Entire refining complexes in the Midwest and Gulf Coast were configured to process heavy Canadian oil, and those facilities cannot easily switch to lighter crude from other sources without significant modifications. And now, those refineries face competition from Asian and European buyers willing to pay global prices for the same Canadian barrels. Mark Carney is not blocking sales to the United States. He is simply allowing Canadian producers to sell at market rates to the highest bidder, and increasingly, that bidder is not America. South Korea's LNG purchases represent a long-term commitment that will continue delivering Canadian gas across the Pacific. India's emerging uranium agreement with Saskatchewan producers covers roughly 10 years of supply, worth about $2.8 billion. Future pipeline capacity toward the Pacific will likely attract additional long-term buyers seeking to protect themselves from disruptions similar to the current shutdown in the Strait of Hormuz. Each new contract strengthens Canada's position as a stable supplier that operates outside the volatile shipping lanes of the Middle East, and countries that recently realized how vulnerable those routes can be may prefer suppliers capable of delivering energy without passing through contested waters. Alberta's oil sands industry alone employs more than 150,000 people directly, while supporting hundreds of thousands of additional jobs throughout the supply chain, from equipment manufacturing to transportation, engineering services. Rising oil prices increase royalty payments to provincial governments and expand investment across communities connected to the industry. And the economic benefits flow directly into Canadian communities, rather than subsidizing American refineries through below-market pricing. That is not hostility toward the United States. That is basic economics. For Washington, the implications are severe. The United States built decades of energy infrastructure, assuming Canadian oil would always flow south at discount prices. Refineries invested billions based on that assumption. Supply contracts were structured around it, and now that model is breaking down because Canada has options it did not have before. The Trans Mountain Expansion LNG Canada uranium deals with India, and oil shipments to China each represent a customer willing to pay global prices rather than the discounted rates American buyers enjoyed for years. Mark Carney did not impose tariffs, and he did not block exports. He simply allowed Canadian energy to reach global markets at global prices. The result is that American refineries now compete with buyers in Asia and Europe for the same Canadian barrels they once purchased at massive discounts. When crude that used to sell for $40 below benchmark suddenly commands near benchmark pricing, that cost increase flows directly into American fuel prices, refinery margins, and energy security calculations. The leverage has shifted, and the United States is discovering that being Canada's only customer once gave American refineries negotiating power that no longer exists once Canada can sell to the world. This is not a crisis Mark Carney created. It is a crisis American policymakers ignored while assuming Canadian energy dependence would last forever. It will not. The infrastructure is built, the contracts are signed, and Canadian oil is flowing to markets willing to pay what it is worth. America just lost its discount supplier, and there's no getting that leverage back.